All right, California is the first state in the nation to create a reparations task force. And even though not a single check is even close to being cut, there's already a beef over who exactly will get compensated. Now, Tuesday, after a heated debate, the panel narrowly voted to limit eligibility to African Americans who are descendants of a chattel enslaved person or a free black person in America prior to 1900, instead of including all black Americans regardless of lineage. So what that means is nearly 200,000 black immigrants in California who hail from places like Africa and the Caribbean could potentially be left out if there is ever any money at all. So let's get into this. This is sure to be a fire discussion. Joining me now is attorney and chair of the California Reparations Task Force, Camilla Moore, and still with us, the amazing, awesome Jelani Cobb. All right, Camilla, I got to kick it off with you. Your task force voted this week to limit compensation, as we just said, to the descendants of freed and enslaved black people who were in the U.S. in the 19th century. However, there are many people whose ancestors were enslaved and have lived here for nearly 200 years. Why exclude those folks, and how do you account for the harm that took place after enslavement, like redlining and Jim Crow, the war on drugs, violence, etc.? Your thoughts?
Thank you. So the California Reparations Task Force decided to define the community of eligibility in line with the intent of the author of the California Reparations Bill, Secretary of State Shirley Weber. And specifically, the task force decided to define the community of eligibility as those African Americans who are descendants of a chattel enslaved person or a free black person in America prior to 1900. And in January, Secretary Weber testified to the task force that lineage-based eligibility was her clear intent. Also, the language in the California Reparations Bill also overwhelmingly supports our decision for lineage-based eligibility. In addition, race-based or all Black people policies are illegal and unconstitutional in California under Prop 209 and the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. But lastly, from a common sense perspective, I think reparations for United States slavery and its legacies, Jim Crow and the new Jim Crow, should be for the descendants of U.S. slavery and its legacy, Jim Crow and the new Jim Crow.
But you're saying race-based policies are deemed illegal, but this really isn't race-based, because my question to you wasn't why aren't all, like every single black person included. My question is specifically for people who have been here since enslavement, whose families were certainly harmed by policies like Jim Crow, like the war on drugs, et cetera. So, you know, I don't know that including that group of people would necessarily be illegal, according to what you were saying.
Well, potentially it could, because a harms-based model, particularly in a multicultural California, would actually would allow for other non-people of color to actually be included. And so, again, race-based standards are illegal under constitutional law standards. And we're not saying that, you know, we're not going to face some type of challenge, but a lineage-based approach would be the least likely to be challenged under constitutional law standards.
Jelani, weigh in here. I'm curious your thoughts, because would a lineage-based approach be, you know, more division in the black community when it comes to this? Would it be a win for some of the harm that we've already seen take place amongst our people? Your thoughts?
I think it's a weird argument, you know, that, like, one, kind of take a look at that book over your shoulder, Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, where she talks about specifically the way that race operates and creates an overall effect of subordinating entire populations, even across lines of class. Now, beyond this, if we look at the fundamental fact of it, California was not a slave state. It entered the Union in 1850, part of the Compromise of 1850, which in turn created a slave-catching bureaucracy. That in order for California to enter the Union, other people who had escaped slavery were now more likely to be dragged back into slavery in other places. So the argument that people who descend from a free person prior to 1900 is entirely arbitrary. I don't understand the basis of this. And ultimately, if we talk about specific policies, specific discriminatory policies that looked at people as groups, then it would only make sense to respond in terms of recompense for the communities that were affected by that. And so what this ultimately is a kind of black equivalent of kind of the white nativism that we've seen on the right for so long.
Camilla, your response.
Yeah, so first, there was, in fact, slavery in California. Second, if you escaped slavery and came to California, if caught, you would be re-enslaved under California's Fugitive Slave Act, which was enacted 2 short years before they were admitted to the Union as a free state. Also, third, 80% to 90% of Black California today is a descendant of a chattel enslaved person who was enslaved somewhere in the U.S. As such, they carry that legacy of slavery and Jim Crow with them. Also, the California Reparations Task Force is charged by law with addressing the effect of the legacy of slavery, including Jim Crow and the new Jim Crow, on the descendants and not on all Black people. And that's our legal obligation. But to answer your last point about the free Blacks, why are they included? Secretary Shirley Weber wanted us to include free Blacks because of the unique risk they faced during slavery and Reconstruction. Free Blacks could at any time be captured and sold into slavery. Take, for example, Solomon Northup from the movie 12 Years a Slave. He was a free Black person who was then captured and sold into slavery. So Secretary Weber thought it was important to include the descendants of free Blacks based on the unique history of African Americans in this country.
Jelani, I want to give you a chance to respond. Go ahead.
I think it's important to be precise in our language. So what I said was California entered as a free state, not that there wasn't slavery in free states, which is also the basis that we know for the Dred Scott argument, for the Dred Scott case. We're much more sophisticated in to believe that the fact that the state did not permit slavery didn't mean that there were never slaves in that state. Now, my other point is that if you're going to pick 1900, 35 years after the ratification of the 13th Amendment, then you are then dealing with arbitrary distinctions. And we should also make the final point that many of the people who are enslaved are in fact also of descendants of other places. When we look at the slave population of Louisiana, for instance, and the number of people who were brought from Haiti after the Haitian Revolution into Louisiana. So these are not either or categorizations. So my entire point is that this is an arbitrary means of carving out the distinctions between people who experienced exploitation and oppression in one way and people who look the same as them, who experience that same exploitation and oppression, but just after an arbitrary cutoff point of 1900.
Jelani, I want to just follow up. We're a little out of time, but what is this conversation? Because even the conversation, both of you guys have strong feelings about this. Jelani, I appreciate your historic perspective. People are, Twitter is on fire right now. I'm curious, Jelani, though, what does this do about the larger conversation around reparations? Because that, this is very California specific. And so does this advance the cause? Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee picked up the torch after Congressman John Conyers left Congress. Does this advance the cause or hurt it?
Well, I mean, what I think is that we're looking as if slavery was the end of the regime. Not that the century of public policy that entailed Jim Crow actually expropriated wealth from people, from the communities. Or if we looked at the kinds of disparities that we see now, health disparities, educational disparities, economic disparities, employment disparities, those tend to affect people more or less across lines of race. There's some distinctions with immigrant groups, but over a course of a second or third generation, those distinctions tend to disappear. And so we're looking at a kind of exclusionary and arbitrary version of what we think is the worst thing that ever happened to this community. But we really need to be looking at it in its entirety, like all of the public policies that affected people of African descent in this country and created the overall disparities that we see in life opportunities for people who are Black.